The flames rose high above the crystal towers of Korath Prime, painting the violet sky in shades of orange and black that no living Corvani had ever witnessed before this terrible day. And Elder Vethral stood at the window of the great archive, watching his world die piece by piece as the Hegrath warships continued their merciless bombardment from orbit. He had lived for 300 cycles, longer than most of his kind, and in all that time he had dedicated himself to preserving knowledge, to protecting the ancient texts that contained the wisdom of 1,000 civilizations across millions of years. Yet none of that knowledge could save them now the archive shook as another blast struck somewhere in the eastern district, and Vethral gripped the stone railing with his four-fingered hands, steadying himself as dust fell from the ceiling above. "Elder," a young voice called from behind him, and he turned to see Silicor rushing through the doorway, her silver scales covered in ash and her uniform torn from battle. "The Defense Council has fallen. The Hegrath ground forces have breached the inner city." Vethral nodded slowly, his ancient eyes holding a sadness that went beyond this single moment of destruction. For he had seen this pattern repeat itself across the galaxy for decades. Now the Hegrath Dominion had risen like a plague 40 years ago, sweeping across star systems with a hunger that could never be satisfied, conquering and enslaving every species they encountered. And now they had finally come for the Corvani, the keepers of galactic history, the peaceful scholars who had never raised weapons against anyone. "How many ships remain in our fleet?" Vethral asked, though he already suspected the answer would bring no comfort. Silicor lowered her gaze, and her voice came out barely above a whisper. "7, Elder. Only 7 vessels still function, and they are attempting to evacuate civilians from the northern spaceport. 7 ships against the Hegrath armada that numbered in the thousands. 7 fragile hopes carrying perhaps a few thousand survivors, while billions remained trapped below, waiting for death or enslavement." Vethral turned back to the window and watched a Hegrath cruiser drift across the sky like a predator savoring its kill, its weapons charging for another devastating strike. "There is something I must show you," he said suddenly, moving away from the window and walking deeper into the archive. Past rows of crystalline storage units that held the accumulated knowledge of countless generations, Ilika followed, confused but obedient, her respect for the Elder overriding her warrior instincts that screamed at her to return to the battle outside. They descended 3 levels below the main floor, passing through security barriers that recognized Vethral's genetic signature, until they reached a chamber that Silicor had never known existed. The room was small and circular, with a single pedestal in the center, holding a crystal that glowed with a soft blue light, pulsing gently like a heartbeat. "What is this place?" Silicor asked, her eyes wide with wonder despite the chaos above. Avel approached the pedestal and placed his hand upon the crystal, activating holographic displays that filled the air around them with ancient text and images. "This is the Vault of Uncertainties," he explained, "where we keep records that have never been verified, accounts that seem too impossible to believe, stories that most scholars dismissed as mythology or madness." He gestured at one particular display, and the hologram expanded to show a small blue and green world orbiting a yellow star at the very edge of the galaxy, in a region so remote that no known civilization had ever explored it. "What world is that?" Silicor asked, studying the image with growing curiosity. "The records call it Earth," Vethral replied. "And according to the oldest fragments in our archive, fragments that predate even the Corvani civilization, this world gave birth to a species unlike any other in the cosmos." The display shifted to show crude drawings of bipedal creatures, tall and strange, with only 2 arms and 2 legs, their bodies covered in various shades of skin rather than scales or fur or carapace. They called themselves humans, Vethral continued, and the ancient texts described them in terms That sounded like fantasy rather than fact. He began reading from the holographic text, translating the archaic language into words Silicor could understand. Born on a world of crushing gravity and violent weather, forged by predators and disease and constant struggle, the humans developed traits that seemed contradictory but proved devastatingly effective. They were soft-skinned yet nearly impossible to kill, short-lived yet possessed of patience that outlasted mountains, physically weak compared to most species yet capable of endurance that defied biological explanation. Silicor listened with skepticism written across her features, for she had trained as a warrior her entire life and knew what strength looked like. And these humans sounded more like children's tales than real beings. Why are you showing me myths while our people die above us? She demanded, her patience wearing thin Vithral, fixed her with a gaze that held centuries of wisdom and something else. Something that looked almost like hope, because I have spent my entire life studying these records, he said. And I believe they are not myths at all. I believe the humans existed, perhaps still exist somewhere in that distant corner of the galaxy. And I believe the reason no one has ever found them is because they were never meant to be found until they were needed. An explosion rocked the archive above them, sending cracks racing across the ceiling of the vault. The texts speak of human warriors who would travel across impossible distances to defend those who could not defend themselves. Vethral continued urgently, of a species that considered protecting the innocent to be a sacred duty rather than a strategic calculation. Silicor shook her head, unable to accept what sounded like desperate fantasy. Even if these humans were real, they are on the other side of the galaxy. They can never reach us in time. No one can save us now. But even as she spoke those words, a signal began flashing on the archive's communication system. A signal that made no sense according to every database the Corvani possessed. Elder, a voice crackled through the speakers, filled with confusion and something that might have been wonder. Our sensors have detected an unknown vessel entering the system. It is using communication frequencies we have never encountered before, and its design matches nothing in any of our records. Vethral's hearts began beating faster than they had in decades, and he looked at Silicor with tears forming in his ancient eyes. Perhaps, he whispered, the myths have heard our prayers, far above the dying world. At the edge of the star system, a ship emerged from hyperspace, its hull bearing words in a language no species in this part of the galaxy had ever seen. USC Crimson Dawn, and aboard that vessel, Captain Daniel Harper looked at the tactical display showing hundreds of warships bombarding a defenseless planet, and he felt something cold settle into his chest, something that every human recognized but rarely spoke of openly. It was the quiet anger that came before action, the fury that humans had learned to control but never to eliminate, the inherited rage of a species that had clawed its way to the stars through blood and sacrifice and the absolute refusal to accept defeat. All hands, he said into the ship-wide communication system, his voice calm despite the fire building behind his eyes. Battle stations. The myth had arrived. Captain Daniel Harper had spent 20 years in the United Space Command, serving on vessels that patrolled the solar system and protected Earth's growing network of colonies. But nothing in his training had prepared him for what he was witnessing on the tactical display. Hundreds of warships surrounded a planet that glowed with the fires of orbital bombardment, and smaller vessels moved between the chaos, systematically destroying what appeared to be civilian transports attempting to flee the destruction. Lavra, he said, turning to his chief diplomat, who stood beside him on the bridge. What can you tell me about those distress signals we intercepted? Lavra Mitchell had been working on the alien transmissions for 3 days straight, barely sleeping as she struggled to decode languages that humanity had never encountered before. And her eyes were red with exhaustion, but bright with determination. The victims call themselves Corvani, she reported. Pulling up her analysis on the main screen, they appear to be a peaceful species. Scholars and historians, from what I can gather. And the aggressors are called the Hegrith Dominion. She paused, her expression darkening as she continued. Based on the signal fragments I have decoded, the Hegrith have been conquering civilizations across this region for decades. They take no prisoners except for slaves. And they show no interest in negotiation or mercy. The bridge fell silent as the crew absorbed this information. For humanity had always wondered what they would find when they ventured beyond their own small corner of the galaxy. And now they had their answer. The universe was not empty. It was at war. We have a choice to make, Harper said, addressing his senior officers who had gathered around the command table. We can retreat, return to Earth, and report what we have found. No one would blame us for choosing survival over intervention in a conflict we do not understand. Kevin Morris, the tactical officer, shook his head before the captain had even finished speaking. His jaw set with the stubborn resolve that had made him one of the finest strategists in the fleet. Captain, look at those transports, he said, pointing at the display where Hegrith interceptors were closing in on slow-moving civilian vessels. Those are families trying to escape. Children dying because they were born on the wrong planet at the wrong time. If we turn away now, we are no different from the ones pulling the trigger. Megan Shaw, the chief engineer, nodded in agreement. Her arms crossed over her chest as she studied the tactical situation with a calculating eye. The Crimson Dawn was built for deep space exploration, she added, but she was also built tough enough to survive anything the universe could throw at her. We have weapons, we have shields, and we have a crew that knows how to fight. Harper looked around the bridge at the men and women who had followed him across the galaxy, and he saw no fear in their eyes, only the grim determination that had carried humanity through every crisis in their history. Then we fight, he decided. And the words carried the weight of a promise that would echo across the stars. Helm, take us in. Put us between those transports and the Hegrith interceptors. The Crimson Dawn surged forward, its engines burning bright as it dove into the heart of the battlefield and across the system. Every sensor array and communication device registered the arrival of something unprecedented. Scylla Kor was piloting her damaged fighter through a field of debris when the unknown vessel appeared on her screens. And at first, she thought the battle damage had corrupted her instruments because the ship matched nothing in any database she had ever accessed. It was smaller than a Hegrith cruiser, but moved with a speed and agility that seemed impossible for a vessel of its size, cutting through the chaos like a blade through water as it positioned itself directly in the path of the interceptors, pursuing the civilian transports. Unknown vessel, she broadcast on an open channel, her voice desperate and hopeless. Please, if you can understand me, we need help. They are killing everyone. For a moment there was only silence, and Scylla Kor prepared herself for disappointment, prepared to watch another potential ally flee from the overwhelming might of the Hegrith. A voice responded, speaking her language in broken but understandable words that someone had clearly assembled from the distress signals themselves. This is the human vessel Crimson Dawn, Laura Mitchell said, her pronunciation awkward but her meaning clear. We hear you, we see you, and we are not leaving human, Scylla Kor thought, her mind racing back to the stories Elder Vethral had shared in the vault. The ancient myths about a species from the edge of the galaxy, the impossible warriors who protected the innocent, the legends that no one believed were real aboard his command ship. Supreme Commander Draxvon watched the strange vessel with growing irritation, for he had conquered 47 civilizations and never once encountered a species bold enough or foolish enough to challenge the Hegrith so directly. Where is that ship? He demanded, his massive form looming over the tactical officers who scrambled to provide answers. "Unknown. Supreme Commander," one of them replied nervously. "The vessel does not match any design in our databases. The species aboard does not appear in any of our intelligence files. We have no information on their capabilities or intentions." Draxvan's lips curled back to reveal rows of serrated teeth, and his eyes narrowed with a predator's focus as he studied the newcomer. "Hail them," he ordered. "Inform them that they have entered Hagrith territory and will surrender immediately or be destroyed." The message was transmitted, and the response came within seconds. Not from the diplomatic officer, but from the captain himself. "This is Captain Daniel Harper of the United Space Command," the human said, his voice carrying none of the fear or submission that Draxvan expected. "We have witnessed your attack on civilian vessels and your bombardment of a populated world. These actions are unacceptable. You will cease your assault immediately or face the consequences." Draxvan actually laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through his bridge. For no species had ever spoken to him with such defiance. "One ship," he said, amusement dripping from every word. "You threaten the Hagrith Dominion with one ship?" "One ship is all we need," Harper replied. And something in his tone made several Hagrith officers shift uncomfortably at their stations. Draxvan's amusement faded, replaced by cold calculation as he decided to make an example of this arrogant newcomer. "Destroyer Vanguard," he commanded. "Eliminate that vessel. Show them what happens to those who dare challenge Hagrith supremacy." A massive warship broke formation and moved toward the Crimson Dawn, its weapons charging with enough firepower to crack a small moon and across the battlefield. Every eye turned to watch what everyone expected to be a swift and brutal execution. But Kevin Morris was already entering commands into the tactical system, his fingers flying across the console as he calculated firing solutions and evasion patterns. "Captain," he said with a grim smile, "let us show them what humans can do." The Hagrith destroyer opened fire, and the battle that would change the galaxy forever began. The first salvo from the Hagrith destroyer should have ended everything, for the weapons aboard that vessel had shattered fortresses and melted warships across 100 worlds. And no sane pilot would have attempted to evade fire from such overwhelming force. But sanity, as the galaxy was about to learn, was a relative concept among humans. Kevin Morris shouted commands as Daniel Harper threw the Crimson Dawn into a spiral dive that pulled 7 gravities of force, a maneuver that would have killed most species instantly. As the blood drained from their brains and their organs collapsed under the pressure, the human crew merely grunted with discomfort as their seats absorbed most of the impact, their bodies hardened by generations of evolution on a world where gravity was a constant enemy to be overcome. The Hagrith weapons fire passed through empty space where the human ship had been moments before, and the destroyer's targeting systems struggled to recalculate as the Crimson Dawn twisted and rolled in patterns that no computer model had ever predicted. "Return fire," Harper ordered, his voice strained but steady as he pulled the ship through another impossible turn. "Target their weapons arrays." Megan Shaw had already rerouted power from non-essential systems to the main batteries, her hands dancing across the engineering console as she pushed the ship beyond its design specifications. "Weapons hot," she reported. "Giving you everything we have, Captain." The Crimson Dawn's guns spoke in response, sending bolts of energy screaming across the void with precision that startled everyone watching. For human targeting computers, calculated trajectories using algorithms developed through centuries of warfare on their violent homeworld. The first shot struck the destroyer's forward weapons array, punching through shields that had never been breached by any species the Hagrith had encountered. And secondary explosions rippled across the enemy vessel's hull aboard his command ship. Draxvan watched the battle with growing disbelief. his clawed hands gripping his throne so tightly that the metal groaned in protest. How are they doing this? He demanded, but none of his officers could provide an answer because they had never seen anything like the small ship that danced through their destroyers. Fire like a leaf in a hurricane. Ancient records that Elder Vethrol had preserved spoke of humans as deathworlders, creatures born on a planet so hostile that merely surviving to adulthood was an achievement that would have been impossible for most. Galactic species Earth's gravity was crushing. Its weather was violent, its predators were relentless, and its diseases were constantly evolving to find new ways to kill. Yet humans had not merely survived these challenges. They had thrived and eventually conquered their world entirely. This heritage now manifested in ways that the Agrath could not comprehend. Human bones were dense and strong, capable of withstanding impacts that would shatter the skeletons of other species. And human muscles had evolved to function under stress that would leave others paralyzed. Human reaction times were measured in fractions of seconds, honed by millions of years as both hunter and hunted. And human minds could process tactical information with a speed and creativity that no peaceful civilization had ever needed to develop. Kevin Morris exploited every one of these advantages as he coordinated the counterattack, using tactics drawn from Earth's long history of conflict. Target their engine section, he commanded, identifying weak points in the destroyer's design that its creators had never thought to protect, because no enemy had ever gotten close enough to exploit them. They are built for intimidation, not actual combat against a determined opponent. The Crimson Dawn swept around the destroyer's flank, moving so fast that the larger ship could not track its movements, and unleashed a devastating volley into the enemy's propulsion systems. The destroyer shuddered as explosions tore through its engineering section, and warning lights flashed across Hegrath consoles as the massive vessel began to drift. Crippled, but not destroyed, Silicork watched from her damaged fighter with tears streaming down her scaled face. For she had seen the Hegrath crush every resistance they had ever faced. And now a single unknown vessel had done what entire fleets had failed to accomplish. The myths are real, she whispered to herself. And for the first time since the invasion began, she felt something other than despair. The news spread across the Corvani defense network like wildfire, carried by desperate communication officers who could hardly believe what they were reporting. A ship had appeared from nowhere, crewed by a species called humans that existed only in ancient legends. And that ship had crippled a Hegrath destroyer in single combat. Elder Vethrol received the report in the vault beneath the archive, and he sank to his knees as the weight of vindication washed over him. For he had spent his entire life believing in something that everyone else had dismissed as fantasy. They came, he said, his voice breaking with emotion. After all this time, they actually came. He immediately ordered the ancient texts about humanity to be transmitted to every Corvani ship and settlement, not as scholarly curiosities, but as proof that hope still existed. Proof that the Hegrath were not invincible. Proof that legends could become reality when the universe was desperate enough to need them. Draxovan watched his crippled destroyer drift helplessly and felt an emotion he had not experienced in decades of conquest uncertainty. He had built his empire on the assumption that superior numbers and firepower would always triumph, that no species could stand against the Hegrath war machine once it began to move. But now a single ship from an unknown civilization had proven that assumption wrong. All ships hold position, he ordered, his voice cold and calculating. We are withdrawing to reassess the tactical situation. His officers stared at him in shock, for the Supreme Commander had never ordered a retreat in his entire career. Sir, one of them dared to ask. We outnumber them thousands to one. Surely we can overwhelm. Did you not see what just happened? Draxvan interrupted, his eyes fixed on the human vessel that now held position between his fleet and the fleeing civilian transports. That ship moves in ways our computers cannot predict. Fights with tactics our strategists have never encountered. And its crew survives forces that would kill any of us instantly. He rose from his throne and walked to the viewport, staring at the small vessel that had just changed everything he thought he knew about warfare. "I want to know who these humans are," he said quietly. "I want to know where they come from, what makes them different, and how they can be destroyed. Until I have that information, we do not engage them again." The Hegrath fleet began to pull back and across the battlefield. The survivors of the Corvani Defense Force watched in amazement as the conquerors, who had seemed unstoppable, finally hesitated aboard the Crimson Dawn. Daniel Harper let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, and looked around at his crew with pride and determination in his eyes. "This is not over," he said, knowing that they had won a battle but not the war. This is just the beginning. 3 days had passed since the battle that shook the foundations of the galaxy, and Lara Mitchell stood in the central chamber of the Corvani Alliance Command Center, surrounded by beings who looked at her with a mixture of awe and desperate hope. She had spent those 3 days learning everything she could about the war that humanity had stumbled into, and the scope of the Hegrath's crimes left her struggling to find words in any language. 47 civilizations, Elder Vethral said, his holographic displays showing a map of the galaxy marked with dozens of red symbols. Each one of these marks represents a species that has been conquered, enslaved, or completely exterminated by the Hegrath Dominion. Lara studied the map with growing horror, for the pattern of conquest was clear and methodical, spreading outward from the Hegrath homeworld like a disease consuming healthy tissue. Why has no one stopped them? She asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Silicor, who had been promoted to liaison officer following her heroic actions during the battle, stepped forward with bitterness evident in her voice. "Because most of the civilizations in this region evolved on peaceful worlds," she explained. "Our species developed cooperation and knowledge because survival did not require violence. We never learned how to fight because we never needed to fight. Not until the Hegrath came." Daniel Harper listened from his position near the window, looking out at the scarred landscape of Corvith Prime, where reconstruction crews worked desperately to repair the damage from the bombardment, and the Hegrath evolved differently, he said. Understanding the fundamental problem immediately, they evolved as predators, Vethral confirmed. Their world was hostile, their competition for resources was brutal, and they carried that violence with them when they reached the stars. But even they pale in comparison to what the ancient texts describe about Earth. The Elder pulled up the records that Silicor had seen in the vault, the fragmentary accounts of human evolution and history. "Your world has higher gravity than any inhabited planet in our records," he continued. "Your atmosphere is a corrosive mixture of gases that would poison most species. Your weather patterns include storms that could level cities, and your biological history is an endless chronicle of predation, disease, and conflict." Lara nodded slowly, for she had never thought of Earth as particularly dangerous. But she was beginning to understand how extraordinary human existence must seem to species who had never known such challenges. "We adapted," she said simply. "We had no choice." Kevin Morris had been studying the Corvani tactical databases for hours, learning everything he could about Hegrath military capabilities and weaknesses. And now he joined the conversation with a plan forming in his mind. "The problem is numbers," he said, pulling up a strategic analysis on the main display. "We cannot defeat the Hegrath fleet in direct combat. They have thousands of ships, and we have one, even with our advantages. Mathematics eventually wins. Then what do you suggest?" Silicor asked, her warrior instincts eager for any strategy that might give them a chance. Kevin smiled. And it was not a pleasant expression, for it contained all the cunning that human beings had developed through thousands of years of fighting. Against impossible odds, we do not fight their fleet, he said. We fight their confidence throughout human history. Small forces have defeated larger enemies by using fear as a weapon, by making the enemy believe that we are everywhere, that we are unstoppable, that fighting us will cost more than they can afford to pay. He began outlining a plan based on guerrilla tactics and psychological warfare, concepts that seemed completely alien to the Corvani, who had never developed such thinking. The Hegroth have conquered the galaxy by making everyone believe resistance is futile, Kevin continued. But we just proved that belief is wrong. Now we need to spread that proof to every conquered world, every enslaved population, every species that has given up hope. Silicor understood immediately, and her eyes lit up with fierce determination. I can do this, she volunteered. I still have contacts throughout the occupied territories. Pilots and soldiers who surrendered only because they saw no other option. If I show them what happened here, if I show them that the Hegroth can be beaten, they might rise up, Laura finished. Seeing the potential in the plan, not a single rebellion, but 1,000 of them, spreading across every system the Hegroth control. Daniel Harper turned from the window with a heavy weight settling on his shoulders, for he understood what this plan would cost and what it would require. If we do this, he said, we are committing humanity to a war that could last generations. We are one ship, far from home, with no guarantee that Earth will ever send reinforcements. He looked at each member of his crew, giving them the chance to object, to argue for retreat, to choose safety over sacrifice. None of them spoke, because none of them could imagine abandoning the billions who still suffered under Hegroth rule. I am sending a message back to Earth, Harper decided. They need to know what we have found and what we have chosen to do. But whether reinforcements come or not, we are staying. Megan Shaw nodded firmly. We stay. Kevin Morris crossed his arms. We stay. Laura Mitchell wiped moisture from her eyes. We stay. The message was transmitted through the deep space communication system. A signal that would take weeks to reach Earth, but would change human history forever. Meanwhile, Silicor departed on her mission, carrying recordings of the battle and copies of the ancient texts about humanity. Traveling through hidden routes to worlds where slaves still dreamed of freedom, she found her first audience on Threxival, a mining colony where thousands of captured workers toiled in darkness to fuel the Hegroth war machine. The workers gathered in secret, risking execution for the crime of assembly, and watched with disbelieving eyes as Silicor showed them footage of the Crimson Dawn dancing through Hegroth weapons fire. The humans are real, she told them, speaking words that would be repeated across 100 worlds in the coming weeks. They came from the edge of the galaxy, from a death world that makes the Hegroth homeworld look peaceful. And they stood against the Dominion without hesitation. A mining supervisor, his scale scarred from years of brutal labor, stepped forward with tears flowing freely. Why would they help us? He asked. They do not know us. We are nothing to them. Silicor remembered asking the same question. Remembered the response that Laura Mitchell had given her, because humans believe that protecting the innocent is not a strategic choice, she answered. It is a sacred duty. They would rather die fighting for strangers than live knowing they abandoned them. The message spread like fire, carried by smugglers and refugees and slaves who had nothing left to lose. And with each telling, the legend of humanity grew larger and more powerful. Draxon learned of the spreading rebellion from his intelligence network, and his earlier uncertainty transformed into cold fury. He had captured a human probe, a small research device that the Crimson Dawn had launched during its initial exploration, and his scientists had spent days analyzing its contents. What? They found terrified the images of Earth revealed a world of crushing violence, where predators hunted prey without mercy and weather patterns killed millions, where humans had developed weapons capable of destroying their own civilization multiple times over. They evolved on that? One scientist asked, his voice trembling as he reviewed the data. They thrive on that, another corrected. And the distinction was far more frightening. Draxon understood now what he was facing, and he knew that half measures would only give the humans time to inspire more rebellion. Recall the entire armada, he commanded, his voice sharp with determination. Every ship, every weapon, every soldier. We are ending this now. His officers scrambled to obey, for they had seen the same data and understood why their supreme commander had abandoned caution. The humans had to be destroyed before they convinced the galaxy that the Hegarith could be defeated, and so the stage was set for the final confrontation. As the largest fleet in galactic history gathered above Corvus Prime, and a single human ship prepared to face impossible odds once again. The sky above Corvus Prime darkened as the Hegarith Armada emerged from hyperspace, ship after ship appearing until the stars themselves seemed to vanish behind a wall of metal and weapons. Daniel Harper stood on the bridge of the Crimson Dawn and counted the enemy vessels, stopping when he reached 1,000 because the number had already become meaningless. Supreme Commander Draxvon is hailing us, Lavra Mitchell reported, her voice steady despite the fear that everyone on the bridge was fighting to control. Put him through, Harper ordered. Straightening his uniform as the main screen flickered to life, Draxvon's massive form filled the display, his eyes burning with the absolute certainty of victory as he delivered his ultimatum. Human, he said, the word carrying contempt and grudging respect in equal measure. You have caused more disruption in 3 weeks than any species has managed in 40 years. I acknowledge your strength, but this ends now. He gestured at something off-screen, and the view shifted to show the Hegarith fleet in all its terrible majesty. Surrender yourself and your crew, and I will allow the Kolvani to live as subjects rather than slaves. Refuse, and I will burn their world to ash and hunt your species to extinction. Harper felt the weight of the choice pressing down on him, for he was being asked to trade his crew's lives for billions of innocent beings. And every instinct told him that surrender was the only moral option. But Elder Vethral appeared beside him, having traveled to the Crimson Dawn for exactly this moment, and placed a gentle hand on the captain's arm. Do not, the ancient Kolvani said. You have given us something we lost generations ago. Something more valuable than any single world. What? Harper asked, genuinely confused. Hope, Vethral replied. The belief that tomorrow can be better than today. That courage matters, that evil does not always win. If you surrender now, you prove that hope was just another illusion. Harper looked at his crew, at Laura and Kevin and Megan and all the others who had followed him across the galaxy, and saw the same resolve in their eyes that Vethral was describing. They had not come this far to give up. Draxvon, he said, turning back to the screen. Humanity has a saying that I think you should hear. We would rather die on our feet than live on our knees. The Supreme Commander's expression shifted from confident to furious as he realized his ultimatum had been rejected. Then die, he snarled, and cut the transmission. The Hegarith fleet began to advance, thousands of weapons charging with enough combined firepower to crack a planet. And the Crimson Dawn stood alone between them and the world they intended to destroy. All hands, Harper announced through the ship-wide system. It has been an honor serving with each of you. We may not survive what comes next, but we will make sure the galaxy never forgets what humans can do. Kevin Morris activated the tactical systems and prepared for the hopeless battle ahead, calculating angles of attack that might allow them to take down a dozen ships. Before they were overwhelmed, Megan Shaw pushed the engines to their absolute limits. knowing that she would need to perform miracles to keep them flying through what was coming. Laura Mitchell opened every communication channel, broadcasting their stand to anyone who might be listening across the occupied territories. And then something impossible happened. A ship appeared from hyperspace. Then another, then a dozen, then 100. Emerging all around the Corvani system in a chaotic flood of vessels that defied any organized military structure. They were Corvani ships that had been hiding in asteroid fields, waiting for a reason to fight. They were refugee fleets from conquered worlds, armed with improvised weapons and desperate courage. They were slave transports that had been seized by workers who had heard the stories and decided they would rather die free than live in. Chancellor Cora's voice crackled through the communication system. Captain Harper, I hope you do not mind some company. Harper stared at the tactical display as more and more ships appeared. Hundreds of vessels from dozens of species, united by nothing except the belief that the humans had given them. How? He managed to ask. You showed us what courage looks like, Silicor replied. And we remembered that we used to have courage too. Draxfun watched the ragtag fleet assembling with something close to panic clawing at his chest. For his intelligence networks had reported growing unrest, but nothing on this scale. Where did they come from? He demanded, but no one had answers because no one had predicted that the conquered species would ever fight back. The battle began with the ferocity of 1,000 suppressed rages finally unleashed. Kevin Morris coordinated the Allied fleet using every tactical trick humanity had ever developed, organizing the chaotic collection of ships into strike groups that hit the Hegrath from angles they never expected. Corvani vessels target their communication arrays. He ordered mining ships go for their supply lines. Refugee transports screen the civilian evacuations. Do not try to match them in firepower. Make them chase you and wear them down. It was guerrilla warfare on a cosmic scale. The same principles that human rebels had used against empires throughout Earth's history, adapted for a battlefield that spanned an entire star system. The Hegrath fleet was designed to crush organized resistance through overwhelming force. But they had never faced an enemy that fought without formations, without retreat, without regard for their own survival. Ships crewed by freed slaves rammed directly into Hegrath cruisers, their pilots choosing certain death over the possibility of re-enslavement. Varens of conquered worlds flew ancient vessels into the heart of the enemy fleet, broadcasting their species' names so that the galaxy would remember who they were. And at the center of the chaos, the Crimson Dawn became a symbol that everyone rallied around. A small human ship that refused to fall, no matter how much damage it absorbed. Megan Shaw performed engineering miracles, rerouting power from systems that should have been critical, keeping weapons firing and shields holding through sheer stubborn ingenuity. The battle raged for hours, and slowly, impossibly, the Hegrath began to falter. Their rigid command structure could not adapt to an enemy that changed tactics constantly. Their soldiers, who had only known victory, began to panic when faced with opponents who would not surrender. Draxon finally ordered the retreat when he realized that continuing would mean the destruction of his entire fleet. And as the Hegrath ships fled into hyperspace, a sound rose from the Allied vessels cheering for the first time in 40 years. The Hegrath Dominion had been defeated. The war was far from over, but the tide had turned, and everyone in the galaxy knew what Elder Vethral stood on the surface of Corvith Prime, watching the celebrations with tears streaming down his ancient face. And when Daniel Harper's shuttle landed beside him, the Elder bowed deeply. "You came," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "when we had lost all hope. You came from the edge of the galaxy to stand with us." Harper helped the Elder straighten up, uncomfortable with the reverence being directed at him. "We are just humans," he said. "We saw people in trouble, and we helped." Vethral smiled at the simplicity of that statement. The profound underestimation of what humanity represented. "You were supposed to be a myth," he replied. "But myths do not bleed for strangers. Myths do not sacrifice everything for people they have never met. Myths do not weep when the innocent suffer." He looked up at the sky, where the lights of the Allied fleet still flickered among the stars. "You are something far more powerful than a myth," he concluded. "You are real, and you have reminded us all what it means to be brave." Silicor landed her battered fighter nearby and joined them. Her scales scorched and her uniform torn, but her eyes blazing with triumph. "More ships are arriving every hour," she reported. "Word is spreading across the occupied territories. The rebellion has become a revolution." Harper nodded, knowing that the hardest part was yet to come, knowing that humanity had committed itself to a struggle that might last generations. But as he looked at the beings gathered around him, former slaves and defeated soldiers and ancient scholars, all united by the hope that one human ship had ignited, he knew they had made the right choice. "Tell Earth to send everyone they can spare," he said to Lavra. "We have work to do." And so humanity joined the galactic community, not as observers or scholars, but as the species that reminded everyone what courage looked like. The myth had become legend, and the legend was just beginning.